Tonight, what Congress might do on guns. Teaching consent.
If he knew what he was doing was wrong, he might not have done it.
And a retirement home for lab chimps. The Supreme Court said today it won't hear a Trump administration appeal on DACA. The justice's rejection leaves a lower court ruling in place, essentially forcing the government to keep running the program that protects young undocumented immigrants, even though President Trump announced last September that he was ending it. But various states are challenging Trump's decision in court, and earlier this month, a federal judge said the government can't do away with the protections while the litigation plays out. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School won the boys' ice hockey state title yesterday, 11 days after 17 people were killed in Parkland. The team entered the championship as the last seed, but came out on top after back-to-back wins. The boys plan to put their 17 medals, one for each member of the team, on the memorial site to honor the shooting victims.
This wasn't for us, this was for the 17 victims. We played for them.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a daily 5-hour ceasefire in eastern Ghouta, starting tomorrow. It'll be accompanied by a humanitarian corridor to allow people to leave the rebel-held suburb that's been decimated in the past week by pro-Assad forces. More than 560 people have been killed since last Sunday, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Russia's announcement is separate from a 30-day ceasefire the UN voted for on Saturday, which has yet to be implemented. The Jerusalem church on the site where Christians believe Jesus was crucified and buried was closed for a second day in a protest against government officials. Leaders of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre say the government is systematically attacking Christians because of a new local tax on church properties and a proposed law in Israel's parliament that would allow the state to buy up land that churches have sold off to private groups. Jerusalem's mayor defended the tax and said it applies to church-owned properties like hotels and businesses, not churches themselves. The Weinstein Company will file for bankruptcy after plans to sell the film and television studio fell apart. In a letter yesterday, the company's board put the blame on its prospective buyers, partly for failing to deliver on short-term financing until a deal was final. The sale was complicated earlier this month when New York filed a sexual harassment suit against Harvey Weinstein in the studio. The state's attorney general demanded that any deal would compensate victims, not reward people who enabled or perpetuated Weinstein's misconduct. Weinstein has denied allegations of non-consensual sex, and the company's board said many of the allegations made against them were inaccurate.
In the Me Too era, schools across the U.S. are considering adding classes to teach kids about sexual consent. Lawmakers in at least 5 states are working on legislation that would require some form of consent education in public schools at various levels. Oklahoma is one of them.
Hi, is Representative Thompson in by chance? I don't know if she's here. She's not here, so put a check mark by him. Hi, do you have a moment? We're trying to get a bill passed out of committee. It's actually named after Lauren, and Lauren is right here, as a matter of fact.
Nice to meet you.
Lauren Atkins is a 17-year-old high school senior in Norman, Oklahoma, and she's a first-time lobbyist.
And this was named after you? Do you mind telling me what your story is?
I was at a party and someone sexually assaulted me there. I told my parents, I went to the police.
And the biggest issue was he didn't understand what consent was.
Yeah, he had no idea.
Lauren's working with Stacey Wright, an advocate for teen victims of sexual assault, and State Representative Jacob Rosecrans to pass a bill that would give Oklahoma public school teachers training to teach kids about consent. Oklahoma law defines consent as affirmative, unambiguous, and voluntary agreement to engage in a specific sexual activity. The law also says you can't give consent when you're incapacitated from alcohol. Tell me about what happened to you at the party. It was last year, right?
Yes. I got there, just started drinking. I was talking to all my friends. Some of them were playing beer pong. Just typical night. I start throwing up. I don't even remember. I guess I just blacked out in that second. And I woke up and I was on the bed.
And what was happening?
That's when he was raping me.
Afterwards, Lauren and the boy exchanged Snapchat messages where they argued about what happened. He also claimed she had given consent earlier in the night. She says she didn't. Vice News made multiple attempts to reach the accused. We were unsuccessful. Lauren filed a police report, but the district attorney ultimately didn't prosecute. They tell Vice News there wasn't a, quote, reasonable likelihood of proving all elements of the crime.
In that moment, I thought there was nothing else I could do ever. My dad was telling me, he was like, Lauren, like, I'll try as hard as I can to, like, get you justice. Like, we'll do whatever we can, but, like, right now, like, there was no other option we could see.
But Lauren did find another option. Lauren went public with her story, and then teamed up with Stacy, the advocate, who wrote the framework for the law.
We're very proud of you.
Thanks.
It's a wonderful thing you're doing.
Thank you. So many hype men in my life.
What made you decide consent classes would be the solution?
Like, with what happened to me, I feel like if he knew what he was doing was wrong, he might not have done it. I don't think he necessarily did it as a malicious act. It was, like, out of being an idiot.
And so what do you want people to know that he didn't know?
I want them to know where boundaries are. And it's not even just with sex. It's like healthy relationships and what people can and can't do to you.
There are a few models for how to teach consent in the classroom.
Who has heard of the word consent here? Feel free to raise your hand. All right, we see that. There is not just one definition for consent, and that's why it's a little complicated for people to understand that.
Some schools, like Innovations High in Utah, partner with outside groups, like Planned Parenthood, to conduct workshops.
It's important to know that sexual consent needs to be enthusiastic. So if I were to hug Allie right now without asking, she's stepping back, right? So she's not wanting to participate in that, right?
Lauren and her friends say those kinds of conversations are completely absent from the sex ed they get in school.
The way they teach it as if sex is something that just happens to you, not something that, like, you're necessarily in control of.
It really is how it is. Like, they'll just teach you about, like, anatomy, and then they'll be like, wear a condom, don't get STDs, but they won't, like, say much else. I feel like they might be uncomfortable, too.
They don't get into any of the emotions. They just focus on the physicality of it. They just assume it's going to be a perfect scenario. They don't make any room for anything bad to happen.
But the bill doesn't actually require consent to be taught in the classroom. Oklahoma is so conservative, the bill has to be watered down if it has any chance.
So you're starting with a bill that allows for teachers to be taught about consent education, that kind of thing, healthy relationships.
You got it.
Is that because that's the best you can do? Because it's that big of a lift?
Baby steps. We're creating a bridge between our teachers and our students to be able to have those conversations. And then also, once it gets out of these committees, perhaps we start talking to other lawmakers and saying, hey, do you think it would be a good idea to also set this to where we can do a class?
But Oklahoma activists who call themselves parents' rights advocates still say they'll lobby against it.
Well, the wording actually says promote safe and healthy relationships. Well, I don't know about you, but even our definition of safe and healthy relationships might not be the same.
It's very clear from the Me Too movement and the conversation we're having that this isn't taught at home. So do you really trust parents to, teach this kind of thing?
No, I don't necessarily trust parents. But on the other hand, I trust the government less.
So I'm wondering what you think the likelihood of Lauren's bill passing is.
It seems to me that this bill is tied to a personal story. The personal story is tragic, and when lawmakers are sitting across the room from somebody who has walked a brutal path, it is very hard to say no.
The bill got a committee hearing today.
It really could have been prevented by him knowing what was right and what was wrong.
And despite some pushback, it passed. But it still has to pass the full House and Senate before it's signed into law. If the bill fails at any step of the way, Lauren, Stacy, and Jacob have to start over again next year.
If it doesn't pass, which I have a really strong feeling that it will, but if it doesn't, we'll just try again next year, just because it's still going to be just as important next year.
Law enforcement officers
This morning, in a meeting with governors, President Trump said yet again that he's intent on making changes to American gun laws, and he dismissed the idea that the NRA would be a roadblock.
Don't worry about the NRA. They're on our side. You guys, half of you are so afraid of the NRA. There's nothing to be afraid of. And you know what? If they're not with you, we have to fight them every once in a while. That's okay.
That's music to a lot of voters' ears. But in American politics, beating the NRA has never been easy.
Before and after Parkland, there have been a few gun safety proposals floating around Capitol Hill. They address all the things that polls suggest people really want. Strengthen background checks, raising the legal age for firearms purchases, eliminating bump stocks. The NRA is supportive of some of this stuff, but generally it opposes new laws. Take bump stocks. The NRA is okay with a new regulation banning them, but not a new law. There's some disagreement as to whether or not a new law is needed, but from what we know, you can't ban bump stocks without one.
It's gone. Just don't worry about it. It's gone. Essentially gone, because we're going to make it so tough that you're not going to be able to get them.
Democrat Dianne Feinstein and Republican Jeff Flake are crafting legislation in the Senate that would raise the age limit on all legal firearm purchases to 21. Currently, that age limit only applies for handguns. Trump is for this. The NRA is against it. So for the most part, Republicans will have to decide whether to go with the polls and the president or with the NRA. And here's where the cynicism kicks in. We've heard Republican members of Congress soften on guns before, usually after mass shootings like this one, where kids are the victims. We've also seen the NRA win these arguments in the end. And they do it pretty simply, by winning elections. Americans who support the NRA vote, and they vote every time they're asked. The NRA makes it easier for them to do it, watching Congress's every move and issuing report cards on each member, saying whether they're good or bad on guns. In a lot of districts, getting that F from the NRA traditionally means you're out of office. But there are signs this doesn't work as well as it used to. In 2017, in Virginia, voters put Democrats in office up and down the ballot on a message that was strongly in favor of gun control. The NRA spent big to try to rally their opposition and voters in response, but it didn't work. And that was before Parkland. That brings us to today. A lot of people in Congress are operating as though the old dynamic is still in place. Voting against the NRA is more politically dangerous than voting with it. We'll see in November if that's still true.
Two LGBT activists from Starkville, Mississippi, filed a lawsuit in federal court today, arguing that the town's Board of Aldermen unconstitutionally discriminated against them when it voted last week to deny them a permit to host a pride parade, in what would have been a first for the town.
By a vote of 4-3, the motion passes. The special event request is denied. I'm so sorry, y'all.
The lawsuit points out that over the last 8 years, the Board of Aldermen has approved every application for a parade permit, until this one. Full disclosure, Roberta Kaplan, the attorney who's representing the activists, is a member of Vice Media's diversity board. Vice News reached out to the aldermen who voted against the permit, and we never heard back. But the women behind Starkville Pride were eager to tell their story.
In a matter of 5 seconds, 4 people were the determining factor of a year's worth of my work, 4 years of me being in Starkville, and 22 years of my life. I'm from a town, it's called Corinth, Mississippi. I came to Starkville in 2014 when I started college at Mississippi State. Mississippi State University is housed in Starkville. This is the best place in Mississippi. So we established Starkville Pride, and that included community members, Mississippi State students, everyone that wanted to help. Every college town except for ours in Starkville has Pride. And Starkville has never had Pride. We've never had a Pride celebration. We've never had anything close to it. A parade was crucial. We're gonna come all the way down the street and you're gonna see a lot of the churches because it's Starkville in Mississippi and there are a lot of churches here.
Yeah, we have a lot of churches here. Yeah, and the Methodist Church is at the very end. So when they have the Christmas parade.
And the Christmas parade route is the exact same route that we're using for this parade.
Yeah. Because they get that parade approved every single year. And so we figured if we use that route, that was a pretty safe route because they do it every year.
Yeah.
The Board of Aldermen meeting was the 20th. I asked them to help us to continue to progress this community.
Hi, my name's Alex.
16 people came up and spoke in our favor. People would tell stories of how they were straight, cisgendered men and women, but they were allies, or they had someone in their family that identified as gay, and we had 2 opposing comments. A woman spoke and she said that God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, and she asked the Board of Aldermen to not turn her city into a sin city. And a lot of people don't understand, but that's very common in Mississippi for someone to just come up to you and say that. And then there was a preacher who came up and asked the Board of Aldermen to stay on the side of God.
And so I just pray that you consider what has been said and do what is right, do what is true, and acts against the Pride March or Pride Parade. Thank you.
I knew something wasn't right. So it came down to the vote, and it was a 4-3 vote, and we weren't allowed to have pride.
Okay, we're out.
I just lost it. When you weep, it's like this unintentional just gut. It's like your stomach comes out of your mouth, but in a weird way. And that's what it felt like. Tonight we're having a fundraiser at Dave's Horse Tavern. In the 24 hours from the denial, I spoke to more people than I had ever spoken to in my entire life. Just because we were denied this parade didn't mean the community went away. It didn't mean that our lives were lessened. It didn't mean that the impact wasn't still there. It just meant that we had to do it in a different way. Pride will happen this year and every year until I am put in the ground, as far as I'm concerned.
Tomorrow, the Supreme Court will hear opening arguments in a case that could determine how much reach the American government has over the cloud. Even though the cloud sounds like it's an ephemeral entity that exists beyond borders, its reality is a lot less dreamy. The cloud actually exists as solid physical data centers, which are subject to geopolitical conflicts. In United States v. Microsoft, the fight is centered around a data center used to store email in Dublin. Back in 2013, the federal government got a warrant to search information stored in a Microsoft email account, one they thought belonged to a suspected drug trafficker. Microsoft handed over some of the data the government wanted, data that was stored in the United States. But it refused to give them access to data that was located on a server in Ireland.
The government was effectively asking us to serve as their agent to get those emails from Ireland, to bring them back to the United States, and to turn them over to the government. We believe that that is not authorized by the law.
The law Howard is talking about is the 1986 Stored Communications Act, which says companies can only hand over electronic communications to the government in response to a search warrant. Microsoft is arguing that the law doesn't apply extraterritorially, that is, outside the US.
Well, the Irish government believes that it does have a right to say what happens to emails and other personal information of customers that are stored in Ireland.
A lower court has already ruled for Microsoft, holding that Congress never intended for the Stored Communications Act to apply overseas. But the government is saying that since Microsoft is based in the US, the law should apply to it. And it says criminals shouldn't be allowed to hide information just because a company decides to put their data on a foreign server.
Here is a case where for the first time, the highest court in the United States is going to decide whether there are geographic limits on American law enforcement attempts to gain access to data abroad. Microsoft would like the symbolic victory of pushing back on the American government when it comes to U.S. government attempts to gain access to user data.
Microsoft's interest in this case isn't altruistic. It's concerned that if it loses, it may have a hard time holding on to international customers who don't want their overseas data being subject to American laws. But Microsoft and the government actually agree on one thing: the Stored Communications Act needs to be updated. In fact, Microsoft is backing a bill that does exactly what it's currently arguing against: give law enforcement the ability to gain access to information stored overseas, albeit only after jumping through a host of new legal hoops.
This is James Anderson. He oversees the chimp management program at the National Institutes of Health, where chimps were used in biomedical research to study diseases and test medicines and vaccines.
They're really the closest species to humans, so they've been useful to understand some aspects of human biology and disease processes. They've been used for a little over a half a century. They've been most useful, I would say, in developing vaccines for hepatitis A and B, which are basically non-existent in the country now because of the vaccines.
And they were used a lot in HIV research as well.
They were initially, and the premise there was we assumed that the human HIV came from a chimpanzee virus.
And did it actually turn out to be a good animal model?
It doesn't. They don't typically develop AIDS.
In 1995, after researchers discovered chimps weren't useful for HIV research, the NIH canceled its chimp breeding program. Then, in 2011, an NIH commission concluded that chimps were no longer needed in invasive medical research, which was banned in 2015. But that left the NIH with a unique problem: what to do with all those chimps. The NIH owns millions of lab animals, and in the vast majority of cases, it euthanizes them once they stop being scientifically useful. But for humankind's genetic cousin, Congress made an exception and passed the Chimp Act,
where these chimpanzees who are no longer needed for research can spend the remainder of their lives in humane sanctuaries,
setting up a retirement system which costs about $10 million a year to maintain.
We just don't euthanize chimps. It's just out of respect to their proximity to humans.
There's no regulation, essentially, that bans these chimps from being euthanized, right?
Yeah, I would have to check. It's just not our policy. We don't do that.
The main federal sanctuary is Chimp Haven.
Amy, 2, Lindsay, and Michelle, we're ready for the Butler Habitat release.
2-4, release of Magnum's group into the Butler Habitat. All X-Men check.
So this is Magnum right here. He is the alpha male.
The federal government pays 75% of the cost associated with housing its chimps at Chimp Haven. The rest of its funding comes from the public and other American institutions, like noted animal lover Bob Barker. And what kind of biomedical research were they using?
Most of the issues that we actually deal with the chimpanzees are related to aging. Some of the chimps have been used in HIV and hepatitis studies, and that can sometimes affect their immune systems. Some of the things that we deal with the most are heart disease. Heart disease is the #1 killer of great apes in captivity. Then we have things like obesity and diabetes and arthritis.
But moving just half of the 518 NIH chimps to Chimp Haven has taken more than 10 years, much longer than some would like. Why aren't all the chimps that the NIH owns here right now?
So there's still over 200 chimpanzees that are remaining in research facilities. And in order to bring them here, we're going to need to expand our facilities.
And we didn't know that all the chimpanzees in research would be retired. In fact, I didn't think that would happen within my lifetime.
You ready? You ready?
Yes.
But for the chimps who've already made it to Chimp Haven, retirement from a life in research is a pretty sweet deal.
If you think about chimps in the wild in Africa, they're traveling constantly. They're encountering a lot of novelty. And so it's really important to keep them mentally active here.
So this is Keely here. Come on, Keely, my star.
They keep the chimps engaged through something called positive reinforcement training.
Emma, show them your teeth. Good girl. Ready? Chest. Good girl.
Dr. Raven Jackson Jewett is the veterinarian who cares for all 230 chimps. She says Chimp Haven is the best place for America's aging great apes to retire.
What do you think of the fact that you're working with essentially an aging population that, with the ultimate goal that eventually they will die out and there will no longer be retired chimps that had been used in biomedical research?
We can't change the past. The research has occurred in them, but we want to make sure that we can give them the lives that they deserve. And ultimately, because they are aging, death is going to happen. It's the inevitable. My job is just to make sure that they have the best quality of life.
That's Vice News Tonight for Monday, February 26th.